why don't you introduce yourself?
My name's David Olivero. I am not an English grad, but I do consider myself like a dilettante of literature. So I like to teach myself and read a lot about different things like that.
He's being modest. He's the most well-read person that I know. He's being totally modest. Yeah. So today we thought that we would start off our first discussion by talking about a book that we imagine most of our viewers are familiar with, the Chronicles of Narnia, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Here's my copy. I got the anthology version.
Yeah, this is mine actually from circa 2005. It's an audiobook edition narrated by Michael York. This is actually the first time that I encountered the stories. You can see, I don't know if anyone can actually see that fully, but that's a illustration of Lucy going through the wardrobe and then accompanying CDs. And this edition that I have is a full color illustration by, I always forget the illustrator's name. It's Pauline Bynes, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that rings a bell.
Yeah, full color illustrations. It's a really, really nice edition. So nice, like I've barely even opened it. This isn't the edition that when I reread the story, this isn't the edition that I normally read from because it's too nice. It's actually the 50th anniversary edition, which makes a lot of sense.
I really like some of the original illustrations. This one that I have here, it has the original illustrations in it. You can see like this, these little black and white ones, but it doesn't have them in color. And it doesn't have the original cover illustration either, which is really quite nice. And some of the art that she made for those series is actually really lovely.
Oh, it's beautiful, yeah. And I think he used her all throughout it. I don't think that there was anyone else.
No, I don't think so, because these black and white ones are just imprints of the color ones that are in that book.
That's right. Brief synopsis, without giving too much away, without giving any spoilers away. Of course, there will be spoilers. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Essentially, takes place during the middle of World War II. And you have four siblings. You have Peter, Edmund, Susan, and Lucy, and they're sent away during the war to live in this mysterious professor's house. And one day, when playing hide and seek, the youngest one, Lucy, decides to hide in a wardrobe, and she enters this wardrobe and attempts to go to the back of it, only to discover a snowy wood, literally like a snowy forest. She's transported into this other world. She encounters a faun by the name of Mr. Tumnus, and he explains, well, this is the land of Narnia, and it's a complete magical land with elves, with talking animals, talking beasts,
ogres, minotaurs, fairies, nads, dryads, all the mythological canons there.
Yeah. And so through her interaction with Mr. Tumnus, she finds out that Narnia is actually under a winter spell. The Queen of Narnia, known as the White Witch, has made it throughout the book. It's always winter, never Christmas. It's under this spell, and as it turns out, the four children are destined to break Narnia out of that spell by ascending the four thrones at Cair Paravel, and you can get. Am I forgetting anything else? I guess
you're about right. Synopsis. The only thing I have to add is there's a wrench thrown into this plan, and the wrench's name is Edmund, and. Well, go ahead. Yeah. So how does Edmund come in?
Well, Edmund comes in. She comes back at some point. She comes back to Earth. She comes back through the wardrobe, telling them all, I've been gone for hours. Didn't you wonder where I was? And obviously, there's a difference between Earth time and Narnia time, and so they all don't really believe her. They don't believe any of this happened. And Edmund, one night, he's kind of, I guess you would call him. He's more like, he's kind of cheeky. He's more negative. Yeah.
He's the younger brother, and he's obviously in Peter's shadow, who is the older brother.
Yeah.
And that insecurity sort of drives Edmund to basically betray his family.
Yeah. Because he follows Lucy into Narnia, actually encounters the White Witch,
right.
And had no knowledge about who the White Witch is. He has no background knowledge about anything to do. He doesn't even know where he is.
And he gave Lucy a really hard time, imagining that she was just making all this up. And then when he finds this land, it doesn't exactly change him for the better.
Yeah. He is essentially bribed by the White Witch. she says, "I can give you anything you want in the world," and he says, "Well, I'd like something to eat." So she gives him like a cup of
Turkish delight.
Yeah, she gives him. Well, even before that, she gives him like a cup of. It doesn't even say hot chocolate; it just says something warm and delicious in the book. Yeah. And then he's given Turkish delight, which is a very. I mean, Turkish delight was made famous by this story.
Right. Yeah. It's a little outdated now, but they still sell it in stores in candy bar form. Turkish delight. Big Turk. That's right. There you go. America. Yeah. Right. So it's it's still around.
Yeah, it's still there.
But not something we eat normally. So maybe that's a bit of an outdated reference. But anyway, it's just a sweet honey snack that is made.
It's like I think it's got gelatin in it as well, and there's like different forms of it. But basically, she bribes him to. She says, "Well, if you bring your other siblings back to Narnia to come and see me, then you can have all the Turkish delight that you want, and you'll be this king, and you'll ascend the throne, and you'll rule with me." And so he takes her up on that offer.
Now we as readers obviously know that the witch. Well, we don't know. We've heard a reference as a witch, and we've also heard a reference as a king. So right now it's sort of up to the reader sort of knows which way things are going. But for Edmund, he's a bit bamboozled by her, and he's kind of tricked into believing that she's not a witch, but actually a queen that can provide him with some benefits. Like basically, she bribes him, saying, "You can, if you bring your other siblings here, then I'll make you the king of this land."
Yeah, and that really appeals to Edmund being, I mean, first of all, being the younger brother.
Right.
Also, he's the middle child, essentially.
Yeah.
He is the middle child.
And so the idea of like usurping Peter, his authority within the family is really appealing to him.
Yeah.
He doesn't really, his ideas of kingship are sort of like the negative ideas of kingship.
Yeah.
They're not the noble ideas of kingship that you would hope in a king. So all the while, obviously, everyone's kind of aware that he definitely shouldn't be king, and so then that's where the tension in the story starts to build, I believe.
Exactly, because you have one member. I mean, first of all, you have Lucy's family members not really disbelieving her, just thinking that she's gone mad, she's gone insane, and then you have another member of the family that knows that this world exists, but is a traitor, essentially, is not on the side of the good.
And so the big drama comes when Edmund, returning from Narnia, bumps into Lucy, who's also in Narnia at the same time. She's gone back to visit her friend, Mr. Tumnus, and they bump into each other. And she's so overjoyed that now you know that it exists. You can back me up with the other two siblings, and so they go back through the wardrobe back into the real world, where they meet the other two older siblings, and then what happens?
And then essentially they ask him, well, is this true? Like, did you really follow Lucy? Like, does this world exist? And Edmund says, oh, sometimes, I was just playing with her. I shouldn't encourage her. He plays it off like he was just he was playing make believe with her, that he doesn't actually believe her.
He's in on some kind of joke with her.
Exactly.
And so betrayed, Lucy's heart is broken and she runs off in tears. And then the kids don't really know what to do.
Yeah.
They're a bit nonplussed by her behavior, and so they decide to go to a very interesting character who's not in the book too much, but someone who actually deserves a lot of attention, and that's the professor.
Mm-hmm. The professor essentially is the one who owns the house, and Susan and Peter go to him and they say, listen, we don't know what to do, because she, I believe Lucy runs into his arms crying, and he's taken aback by this, and he asked them, so what's the issue? And they say, well, our sister's gone mad. She thinks that she's discovered a magical land in this wardrobe. We're not sure what to do. And he said, well, how do you know that she's lying? How do you know that she's not telling the truth? And Susan says something along the lines of, well, you have to be bonkers to believe her. And he says, one of your favorite lines, what do they teach in school these days?
Right. Yes, that is one of my favorite lines.
Yeah, it's great. Because he says, well, if she's not mad and you know her not to lie, we have to assume that she's telling the truth.
Right.
That it actually exists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're running from, what's the maid?
Macready.
Yeah, they're running from the Creedy, they call her, I think.
Macready,
they don't call her Miss Creedy, they call her the Creedy, or the Macready.
That's it.
And so, now this house that they're staying in, it's an old manor house in the English countryside. It's got a lot of history, and it's a beautiful place. So, there are tour groups, people that are visiting the country. They like to come and visit some of the old manor houses and the estates in the English countryside. And so one of the things the professor allows people to do is take tours of his house. And these tours are led by the housekeeper, whose name is Mrs. Macready. But Ms. Macready is a bit of a cantankerous character, and she doesn't really like the kids getting underfoot or in the way when she's giving these tours. And so when the when the tours are coming or are going through the house, the kids really have to make themselves scarce. And so on this one occasion, they get kind of caught unawares that there's a tour going on, and so they're forced to sort of run from one room to another. And he says in the book, he doesn't, the kids aren't, looking back, the kids are sort of maybe a little bit suspicious that maybe there was some kind of magic kind of pushing them from room to room to room to room until they ended up in the wardrobe room.
And it's there it is.
But in any case, they finally get pushed from room to room by this tour group, and finally they end up in this room with the wardrobe in it.
Mm-hmm. And then they proceed to obviously know their place to hide, so they hide in the wardrobe.
Right.
And that's when the four of them, all simultaneously at the same time, discover Narnia. And then they set off to explore. And Peter says to Lucy, "Well, like you've been here before. Take us, where should we go?" And she says, "Well, I think we should go call on Mr. Tumnus."
Right.
So they go to Mr. Tumnus's his dwelling, his cave, and they discover that Mr. Tumnus is not there. That, as a matter of fact, his house has been ransacked by Milgram, captain of the secret police, which is the White Witch's secret police. Which
he's
is
a big wolf with a blood red mouth.
Yeah. And they find this note that says that Mr. Tumnus has been taken prisoner for fraternizing with humans, essentially. Sons of Adams and daughters of Eve.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And then that's very signifying. Whenever people meet these kids, they always refer to them as sons of Adam and daughters of Eve, and that's a very clear religious message that he's trying to put through there. Yeah. So you always sort of know. You get an idea of their importance in this world almost right away, because he's sort of relating it to like the Bible and the story of Genesis, taking it right back to the beginning, and so you know right away that these kids have a specific or special destiny that's been set out for them without even knowing too much more about yet the thrones and all that kind of stuff.
And the prophecy.
One thing, when they enter this world, they all realize that Edmund says something to the effect, basically to let on that he's been there before. And everyone clues into the fact that he lied and threw Lucy under the bus. And Peter confronts him, and he calls him a beast. And Edmund really takes this hard. He really doesn't like Peter calling him that. And he doesn't take it in the way that you would expect him to take it, which is, I did something wrong and I should atone or apologize for it. He takes it and he becomes resentful at being caught in his lie, basically. Yeah. And so his resentment keeps getting compounded throughout this part of the story until, well, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, I want the first thing I want to ask you was your first encounter with the story. Like, do you remember the first time that you read it?
Yeah, I do actually. So the first, I read it in a weird order. The first book I read was actually Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and so after reading that, I wasn't acquainted with the story at all. So I didn't really go back to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for a long time. But I think it must have been around 12 or 13. I think I found Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and yeah, I mean, I've been a fan of it ever since. It's a wonderful book, and I always sensed there was something very like elementary about the way it was written. But you get a weird feeling when you read the book that there's something more to be gleaned from it. That the author is trying to say a bit more than he actually sort of simply puts on the page, and I think that's the reason why throughout the years I come back to this book repeatedly and reread it, because I always get the feeling like there's more to be learned from it, and I think that's why I'm a big fan of the book. And that all started when I was about 13 years old, so a long time ago now. I'm not going to say how long exactly, but a long time. Yeah. What about you? When was your first experience with it?
It was definitely around 2005 when the movie was coming out, and I remember actually I think I was like Christmas shopping with my dad, and I think I'd seen probably the trailer for the movie. And we were in the world's biggest bookstore in Toronto, which doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. But he would always take me, my dad would always take me to the bookstore because I just love books and I love movies. And he would usually, he would have errands that he would have to run in the city. And my reward for being patient was he would buy me a book or he'd buy me a DVD or whatever it might be. And so I picked out this exact copy of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, not really knowing anything about it, and I don't even think that my parents had read it growing up. I don't think they really knew anything about it. They just knew that it was they considered it a children's fantasy, and so he bought it for me, and we listened to the audio CD on the way home from Toronto back to where I grew up, which is Alliston, Ontario, which is this little known small town. but I just fell in love instantly. So I don't think I actually fully read the book on my own until I was maybe, because I would have been about 8 years old when I first heard it on audio CD, and I tried to follow along, but at that point in time, I wasn't as into reading as I am now, and so I think the first time that I actually read it completely on my own was probably when I was maybe about 13. So probably right around the same age. Yeah, about the same age.
Yeah.
And I remember I have this distinct memory. I was telling you about this that there was this store where I grew up. It was it was kind of like a Christian Bible store, and they had all 7 of the Chronicles of Narnia books in there. And I remember asking my mom. I said, I don't understand why Narnia is sold in this Christian Bible store.
Yep.
And she said, well, like it's because the Chronicles of Narnia has a lot of Christian elements to it. They're, my mom had even said to me, she said they're allegories. And of course, as I got older and I started to dive deep into that, I realized that they're not black and white allegories. They have allegorical elements. So there's a key difference there. And one of the things that you and I talk about all the time, and one of the things we want to talk about in this video, is how people often, we hypothesize that one of the reasons that people tend to, it's not that they stay away from Narnia, but it tends to not be as popular with a young readership, is because people hear that it has Christian elements in it, and so they kind of they have like a distaste for that for some reason, because I think it's all Christian. It's a story that's trying to instill a message into you.
They might think it's not missionary, but sort of like preaching, I guess.
Preaching,
trying to convert you to Christianity or something like that.
Yeah. It's the furthest thing from it. Like it's not the case at all. It's like it's not. I mean, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I think, compared to the other 7 books, it's the most it's so obvious. Like, I mean, the character of Aslan is obviously like meant to represent
a stand-in for Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And his sacrifice for the benefit of Edmund, which comes later on in the story, his sacrifice for Edmund on the stone table.
There's a very clear resurrection there.
Exactly.
The cracking of the stone table is like, the cracking of the stone in front of Jesus' tomb.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of things that he pulled from that story that he put into this story. However, it's like you were saying, it's not a pure allegory. He doesn't allow the story to suffer because he needs to jam in more allegorical references. He does let the story sort of stand on its own. But I do agree that people do have can have a funny reaction to it because of its Christian undercurrents. And everyone knows C.S. Lewis he's a well-known Christian apologist. He wrote a lot on that subject, and no one should be particularly surprised that it kind of creeps into his other work, I don't think. But it's definitely not a reason not to read the work, that's for sure. I can't imagine being that afraid of Christianity that you would deny yourself a great story just because you're afraid of it maybe having an effect on you in a negative or positive way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think people, it's like more of a reaction to kind of religious fundamentalism that people are kind of they get kind of put off by, because they think that it's like, again, it's somehow going to indoctrinate them for some reason.
Or their kids or something. Yeah. But that's like the farthest thing from it. I think like a kid would really, beyond picking up maybe some of the Jesus motifs and maybe some of the little Bible stuff that's in there, I really don't think a kid would put they're not going to put too much into it right away, I don't think. Unless you go out of your way to explain it to them, they probably would just end up enjoy the story. And the story stands on its own. It doesn't, even without the Christian undertones, it's a good fun story for kids.
Yeah, and I think that frankly, like, there are other works of fantasy that could border on, like, that they have like kind of Christian and Catholic elements to it. I think that you could even argue that the Harry Potter series has some religious elements to it as well. Yeah. I think that there's a reason why. I mean, there's a reason why religions last and they're passed down, because like the stories are so intrinsic to human nature and to the things that are just deeply embedded within our psychology, like our collective psychology, more than I think people realize. And so
he was also writing at a time like Lewis was, I don't know what his political stripes were exactly, but I'm going to guess that he was fairly conservative. He obviously was interested in religion. He was a religious man himself, and I think he looked at sort of the times that he was living through, especially like after World War II and the that what happened in Europe, and he saw that people were moving away from religious philosophy, and I think he wanted to do something positive to turn people back onto it and show them that it didn't have to be quite as stuffy as just reading the King James Bible or something like that. Like you could get religion from other places that would be entertaining and interesting and be meaningful as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that some of those religious themes that run through it, they may not even be necessarily purely religious, but just moral attitudes and things that ideas that he wanted to propagate more.
Yeah, because in some ways, like you and I, there's a YouTube lecture series by Dr. Ryan Reeves. It's called you can YouTube it yourself if you're interested. It's called Lewis and Tolkien, and he teaches at a seminary school, and he does an entire course where you compare C.S. Lewis Chronicles of Narnia to J.R.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, because they were both contemporaries of each other and they were both friends. And I think most people know that, but not everyone knows that they read each other's work. And Tolkien was actually not. In particular, this story, he was not the biggest fan of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I know that he particularly objected to Lewis's inclusion of Father Christmas. Father Christmas shows up, and he gives Susan, Peter, and Lucy basically tools to use for the forthcoming battle against the White Witch and her army, and so but anyways, that series in particular, Reeves talks about how writing in response to modernity. And they both fought in the First World War, and for anyone that's familiar with just with the history of literature knows that during the modern era, with writers like T.S. Eliot and Ernest Hemingway and Virginia Woolf, there was this overarching distrust of not only authority, but also the sense of like decay, the sense that this is the worst conflict that humans have ever seen. What is meaningful? What do we know? What don't we know? There was this distrust of knowledge and this kind of questioning of this grand narrative that we had. There was this sense that religion, I mean, that's also the product of the Enlightenment too, which came way before World War I. But the sense that religion could no longer provide us with explanations as to what was going on in the world, and it led to a lot of disillusionment. And I mean, you read something like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and you see how disjointed it is and how long it is and how you read it. I read that in a 20th century literature class that I took, and I remember thinking, what the hell is going on here? But that's exactly the point. It's exactly the point. And so Lewis and Tolkien were writing in some ways in response to modernity, because they did not like modernism at all. Like Reeves even talks about how neither one of them liked to drive. Lewis was like quoted as saying, "I'm not getting into one of those things." Like when the automobile came along, because they grew up. They were both born around towards the end of the 19th century, around the 1880s, 1890s, and so they came of age during the Gilded Age. Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was originally published in 1950, and that was obviously post World War II. And so in some ways, you think of like Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then you think of Lord of the Rings, because they came out around similar times. I mean, The Hobbit was written in 1937, but they came around times when the literature fantasy was not in. To have these two, I mean, first of all, they were both scholars. They were both academics. To have these two scholars write children's fantasy literature, in some ways in a response to modernity, to usher in back these deep feelings of spirituality and faith and belief into an overly rational age, is something that I think a lot of people forget, and it goes way beyond like any of the Christian elements. It's in response to a lot of things. But,
yeah, really well said. Yeah, that's a really good point. And you get that feeling like the narratives that they choose to write, they're grand narratives. They're big, high-flown narratives about things like kingship and the meaning of good kingship versus bad kingship, or honor and loyalty, and truth, justice. These kind of really big topics. Not concerning with sort of the mendacity of modern life. And so I think what you're sort of saying is like, a lot of writers started to focus on the how awful modern life was, let's just say, okay, and how destructive and disgusting and dirty it was. And these guys sort of saw that, and I think it disgusted them a little bit, and they wanted to produce something more beautiful and something a little greater than anything else that was being made at that time. I think both of them, Lewis as well, were interested in creating something beautiful and something lasting in the face of all this sort of blasted waste that everyone seemed to be kind of preaching after the war, and that a lot of books were concerned with. When when a society sort of loses its religion, then and becomes like what England was becoming at that time, then I think that you end up worshiping unworthy objects, and I think that
faith is displaced.
Yeah, it's
onto
displaced. So
something
you
else.
you worship celebrities in the absence of God, let's say,
Yeah.
and I think that really troubled them a lot,
Yeah,
and they wanted to kind of bring back a joy, a love, an excitement into stories, and yeah, I think that they were pretty successful.
I would say so, yeah, because these I mean, it's 2020, and we're sitting here and we're talking about Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe today. Like there is a timeless quality about both of their work, and I think that the thing that, and you and I have been talking about this a lot, about how Lewis's work on the surface seems to be more. It seems on the surface to be quite simplistic. Like the prose that he writes in. I mean, there's like sentences like if I can give you an example here, like he's we always say like he's a great storyteller, but in terms of the actual quality of his prose, it's like
they're not like very wordy, and that always confused me, I think, because he was a medieval scholar. He was obviously perfectly capable of, writing a lot of high-flown language and beautiful prose, but he specifically chose in this book, you can kind of see it, he specifically chose to keep his language simple and straightforward, and for children specifically. He didn't, even like something like The Hobbit, I think, which is also, I think, written for children, more or less, still uses pretty advanced language. But Lion the Witch and Wardrobe is very simply written.
Yeah.
However, there's like a deceiving amount of complexity in the story.
Yeah.
In this, like, that's between those simple words.
I mean, even like just the ones, like one sentence, like his one description, like it was a full moon and shining on all that snow, and made everything almost as bright as day, only the shadows were rather confusing. It's not like it's not overly flowery. Like he sets the scene. This is what was happening, and there are so many moments where he directly addresses the reader. Like they didn't know who Aslan was any more than you do, and he constantly is repeating, like the idiot, like we were talking about, the constant repetition of like, Lucy kept the door partway open because she knew it was foolish to lock oneself in a wardrobe. Yeah. Or even,
we were debating the meaning of that, why he keeps saying that. See, he repeats that a bunch of times.
I think at least four different times. Constantly.
And we were kind of deciding what, and the only one to close the door, of course, is Edmund. And so we came to the conclusion, I guess, that it was basically just to differentiate Edmund as being a little dimmer than the other three.
A little bit more brash, a little bit more.
Yeah. So, but if you guys have any other ideas of why he's constantly repeating that phrase, please
comment below.
Yeah. I'd be curious to know what everyone's opinion on it is.
One of the things that I noticed as well, more so when I was reading it this time around, was how there's so many obvious parallels between like Narnia and just traditional fairy tales. I mean, you have the whole idea of like the scene where Lucy and Edmund are reunited in Narnia, when Lucy's like, oh, you found Narnia too, like, isn't it great? And they travel back through into the wardrobe. It reminded me a lot of Hansel and Gretel. I got this big image of Hansel and Gretel in my mind. I went, he's hearkening. He's not directly referencing it, but he's making a bit of an allusion to it. He's invoking that the spirit of that tale. And then Babes in the Woods as well, even there's a little bit of, even like you could argue, there's a little bit of Red Riding Hood in there. Lucy encounters Mr. Tumnus, and she doesn't know right away if he's friend or foe.
He's good or bad,
because
it's ambiguous at start.
It is ambiguous, isn't it? Because like there is like something kind of, I mean, even when I was a kid and I'd heard it before I had actually read it. I'd heard it on audio CD. But when that moment happened, I was like, what's going to happen? My first inkling was like, this is the big bad wolf. There's something predatory. There's something ominous that's about to happen. And then he turns out to be quite friendly. I mean, the story could have taken an even darker turn if they had made Tumnus to be, say, like one of the White Witch's henchmen.
He was going to be.
That's a good point. That we forgot about that.
Because everyone was sort of on alert for these four children should they ever return. And they were under obligations to the witch to turn them up at her court if they ever did appear. But his conscience got the better of him because Lucy was such a lovely young girl and very nice,
very intelligent,
and he just couldn't turn her in. So You know, there's something to be said for Lucy in this case. Like the other three siblings, other than Edmund, have like the highest possible qualities of humanity. You know, the best of us, basically. That's what they represent.
Yeah.
And so, you know, even when Lucy gets suspicious of Mr. Tumnus after he starts acting a little sketchy about, you know, her not leaving, and she kind of gets a little worried about what he's talking about, and then he breaks down, and instead of getting, you know, upset with him about it and thinking that, oh, you're a villain, she actually understands and sort of pats his arm and says it's okay, you know, like you know, you're doing the right thing now, and that's what's important. And that's actually a major message in the book is it's despite redemption.
Yeah.
Exactly. Redemption is a huge message in the book, among other, like, you know, among others. And we were talking, I guess, a little bit before about the world of Narnia, and you got a really interesting book.
Yeah.
What was that book called?
So essentially, this is it's called Planet Narnia: The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. It's by Dr. I believe I'm not sure if he's a doctor.
I think he is now, yeah.
Dr. Michael Ward, and essentially he had started his graduate work on studying C.S. Lewis, and I think in particular, I'm not sure if I have this right, he was looking at his poetry in particular, and specifically his poetry about the planets, about the order of the planets in the medieval world.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was called it would have been the
Copernican worldview.
Yeah, exactly. And so he's talking specifically about the seven planets back when the moon, for example, was considered a planet.
Yeah. And remember, Lewis was a medievalist.
Yeah.
So this kind of stuff was in his head all day long, every day, for basically his entire adult life. And he was an expert at this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's not just Ward in his book. I haven't read the whole thing, but he talks a lot about Lewis's other work that we're not discussing here.
Yeah.
Lewis wrote a space trilogy. You guys didn't know that?
Prior to Narnia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He wrote a lot of poetry, and he wrote other apologetics work, and I think he wrote some other fiction as well, before he ever touched on Narnia. And Ward in his work sort of is putting forward the idea that Narnia isn't, though it is a Christian allegory, it actually has a much deeper meaning that is tied into Lewis's understanding of the medieval order of planets. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, and he even, you know, and a lot of people, like there's this. I haven't finished the book either. The most that you and I both read, like the same chapter on Language and Wardrobe, because it's a very dense book. It's a very dense. There's lots of information in it, more than I had expected, because he talks about his work beyond Narnia. Mm-hmm. But essentially, he theorizes that one of the reasons why, because all seven books, the thing that a lot of people dislike about Narnia is that there's not as much of a sense of cohesion between all of the seven stories.
Yep.
They feel like seven different stories that just kind of happen to take place in the same universe, and sometimes the Pevensey children show up, sometimes they don't. Yep. Sometimes Aslan is there in the flesh, sometimes
it's
he's not.
A couple of the Pevenseys and a new person, like
Eustace,
a cousin.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's there's the prequel, like The Magician's Nephew, where it's like the creation of Narnia. Then there's The Last Battle, where it's all kind of like, there seems to be, stressing this importantly, seems to be this lack of unity between the seven stories. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason for that, because Ward theorizes, and a lot of people have agreed with this theory, and then some people have disagreed with it, they've criticized it, that each book in the 7-part series is meant to represent the characteristics of one of the planets in the medieval cosmos. Right. So, for example, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Ward theorizes is meant to represent Jupiter. So Jupiter was known to have things of, obviously by Jove, joviality, kingship. Right. And you look at the story of Narnia, there's a lot of kingship. I mean, mm-hmm. it ends with the Pevensey children ascending the 4 thrones of Carabel.
And the good type of kingship, mm-hmm. okay? Because there's good kingship and there's bad kingship, obviously, right? Mm-hmm. The witch and Edmund, if he carried on down that path, represent the tyrannical aspects of kingship, whereas the Pevensey children and Peter's kingship, and Lucy and Susan and as queens, and Edmund as he was also a king, was he not?
King, yep.
Yeah. Yep. They represent, once Edmund is corrected his course, they represent the good aspects of kingship. Yeah. The social aspects, the loving aspects, the aspects of kingship that are all associated with positivity.
Yeah. You even think about the use of Aslan, and he talks about this in the book as well. Aslan, the lion. The lion is a very kingly kind of
yeah,
symbol.
of course. It's the king of the beasts, king of the
King
jungle.
of the jungle. That's right.
Also a symbol
Yeah.
of kings,
That's
you know,
right.
from time immemorial.
There's one quote there's one paragraph that I think really summarizes so far it's a great book, and I really recommend for everyone to go and check it out. If you're even just a casual fan of the series, really read this. But Ward, and I'm quoting here, in this first chronicle, Aslan as Jupiter is responsible, so to speak, for the whole Narnian world and everything in it. Royal coats and a wardrobe, melting snow, clemency, kings, lions, thrones, feasts, revels, oaks, and faces. Winter does not pass simply as a convenient symbol of regeneration consequent upon the arrival of a Christ figure. His arrival, in the form of a king of the beasts, his crowning of the children, and the passing of winter, are all interdependent images which are selected in order to give expression to Jove, or Jupiter, whose character is being deployed to present a theological message of considerable complexity and subtlety within a framework of superficial simplicity. So I think what essentially Ward is saying there is that on the surface, yeah, the story seems very simplistic, it seems it's very enjoyable, but beneath that, Lewis was intentionally trying to instill this feeling of joy in the story, the feeling of joy. So it's not something that can necessarily be deconstructed in the traditional literary study sense. It's there on the page and in the sentences and what happens in the characters and every aspect of it. It wasn't by accident.
Exactly, yeah. Now we have another thing to consider through Ward's book, which is that the language that he's used was actually carefully chosen by him, not because it was complex or simple, but because it conveyed this joviality that he was trying to impart to everyone through the story. And so that's why he chose the language that he used. It wasn't necessarily because he couldn't write better or he was writing only for children, though he was, but the actual word choices and the tone and the inflection of everything, and right down to him breaking the fourth wall and talking to the reader, and it's kind of it's very playful, the text. And so, and that really went a long way, at least for me, in explaining why he chose to use sort of the language that he used and the simple structure that he decided to use. Because there's this underlying idea of joviality that he's trying to get across. And that's, like you were saying, why the other books tend to have very different tones, because they are based on different planets.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like you even think about, like Ward also theorizes that I believe Mercury, for example, is meant to represent the horse and his boy, the third book, and to be mercurial means to be kind of mysterious, kind of like unable to
and quick to change your mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Mercurial, yeah.
Yep, and as well, and so in the horse and his boy, there is a kind of there's a kind of sense of like, I mean, there's that one part. I think I can't remember the book too well. It's been a while since I read it, but I think there's the character of Shasta where he's traveling through Narnia, and there's a set of footprints that are following him, and he doesn't know whose footprints those are. He's mysterious, and they turn out to be Aslan's, and so there's this idea of like mystery embedded in that book. And then another example is Mars was meant to be kind of the war planet, and Mars is meant to represent Prince Caspian. Prince Caspian, there's a lot of war and battle in Prince Caspian. And I mean, like, there's like more could be said about it, but I really recommend picking up Planet Narnia and checking out the Ryan Reeves series, because Reeves also does a pretty general overview of the planets, and obviously not as great of a detail as Michael Ward, but it's a good place to start.
Yeah, Reeves was a great place to start.
He was. Yeah.
I watched almost all of his videos on Lewis and Tolkien.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed them all a lot. We can talk about a couple characters if you want.
Yeah.
There's the character of the professor. I always found that character really interesting. I felt like that was Lewis. That's Lewis. Okay?
Oh, it totally is. Yeah.
And the professor is you can tell the professor's form has, there's elements of G.K. Chesterton in the professor, and there's a famous essay that a lot of people know that called The Ethics of Elfland, and the professor seems to take a lot of his philosophy as far as whether or not imaginary worlds can exist or not. He takes a lot of his reasoning about that they can exist, and quite easily, from people like Chesterton. And I definitely recommend reading, if you're interested in fantasy at all, or interested in Tolkien and Lewis, to read the Ethics of Elfland by G.K. Chesterton. It's in the book called Orthodoxy, and it's excellent. And he basically says sort of what the professor says to the kids, which is, how do you know that there isn't a world in that wardrobe? And the kids are like, well, that's obviously preposterous. But the professor sort of hits them with that logic about, well, if your sister never lies, and how did it go exactly?
If your sister never lies and she's not insane, then we have to assume
she's telling the truth, right?
Yeah.
So it's just like logically, and that's sort of like not the crux of feel like that's like the most important part of the book, actually, is that you have to allow yourself to believe and to allow magic. In order to allow magic to flow into your life, you have to believe that what you see is not all that there is.
Yes.
And that's a main message of the book, right? It's how do you know? I mean, we live in a very rational world where science has sort of explained a lot of the mysteries away. But if you just, I think what the professor was trying to say is if you just dig a little deeper, it doesn't take too many questions in before you get to the unanswerable and the unknowable. And that's where magic starts. That's where magic begins. And that's where this book begins as well. It begins just a few questions deep, a few rational questions in before you're sort of unable to answer those rational questions anymore. And yeah, anyway, I think that I like the professor a lot just because he's a character who's kept that part of himself, because so much it's sort of beat out of us by the time we get to be adults. We're not really allowed to be, irrational or believe in imaginary worlds anymore. But it's a lot of fun, and I think anyone who does still retain that little bit of childishness and that little bit of joy, I think they're generally happier people, in my opinion.
Usually, yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I had mentioned to you was how it's interesting, like how you brought that up. How the Pevensey children are coming from. They're escaping one conflict. They're escaping World War II. They're being sent away. World War II is happening. They're being sent away to like essentially a safe house, essentially. And what's so interesting is that they're sent to this house for safety, and then, ironically, they get involved into another conflict in Narnia. They get involved between the conflict between Aslan and the witch, and the battle scene in the book is really, it's kind of poured over, like it's only like a few sentences long. In the movie, it's long and drawn out for obvious reasons, because it's for dramatic effect and things like that. And you can do more visually with the battle scene versus textually. But what's really interesting to me is that they get away from one conflict only to be brought into another conflict. And there's actually one bit in the movie that's not in the book, where the character Susan says to Peter, we left home to get away from war. We didn't come here to get into another war. And that is so interesting how they leave, drawing back on what you were saying, they leave this world of rationality. They leave the rational world of Earth, and they come into this fantasy land. And in a way, their ability to deal with the conflict that's happening in Narnia kind of allows them, in a way, to maybe make peace with the conflict that's going on back home. I mean, the war is only referenced like in the first couple of sentences of the book, and then it's kind of left alone. But you also consider Lewis's background, the fact that he fought in the First World War, both Lewis and Tolkien, as a matter of fact, and you consider that, you can only imagine how Lewis must have felt, where First World War finishes, he gets out alive, and then all of a sudden this second global conflict comes into play, and you can only imagine like what he must have thought of that. And so in his own way, I think that he was trying to say something about the fact that war affects children, and that you can't really protect children from conflict, because conflict is going to come in another domain, because again, they leave the conflict of World War II in the real world only to be enlisted in this conflict in Narnia. And so like maybe that's what, I mean, I'm just theorizing here, but maybe that's what he was partially trying to say, that you can't keep children out of conflict. Or
trying to protect them from it is useless, because it'll come knocking on your door whether you invite it in or not. The other thing I want to add to that, we discussed some different interpretations of the book. So we talked about the planets, we talked about the Christian allegory. Now, going back to World War II, there's a lot of symbology to suggest, or you could probably make a case that the whole thing is just actually a World War II analogy, right? Yeah. So you have like the lion, who is a symbol of England. Then you have the 4 children, who are a symbol of the English nation. You have the boys, who are then trained off to be soldiers. And then the girls are busy themselves basically with industry, while the boys are fighting this war. And so there's an analogy for World War II right there. So maybe this is just how the children decided to view the conflict that they were living through. as another analogy.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about, because I was reading this right around the holiday season just passed, and I was reading
Yes,
this right around the holiday season, and there were a lot of, throughout the book, there's this common saying, always winter, never Christmas.
Yeah.
And then then about maybe halfway through the book, Father Christmas shows up, and he gives Lucy, Peter, and Susan these tools to use in the eventual battle. And to me, that was like, it's a lot of people talk about how, oh, it's strange that all of a sudden Father Christmas shows up, Santa comes up. Yeah. But I think in some ways, because this was published in 1950, written around between 1948 and 1949. I mean, he started it way earlier. He had the idea for it years and years previous. But that was right around the time. It was post-World War II. There was this sense of, this renewed sense, again, of like kind of carpe diem. Things are going to be better. Like you saw this push towards consumerism. Christmas was becoming more commercial.
Right.
You know, families coming out of World War II, they want to provide for their children, like materially speaking.
Right.
So you could read this book. I always considered it a Christmas story. I always read it around Christmas time.
And again, Lewis, let's go back. We got to remember he was against a lot of the parts of modernity that were making themselves felt, and he wanted a return to sort of more traditional, a traditional time in England. I think he wanted. I don't want to say he was anti-progressive, but he was definitely like the way
skeptical.
He was skeptical, and he liked the way things were, and I think there was a lot of nostalgia. Like he missed sort of the England that he grew up in, and wanted to return to those values, and that materialism, that growing materialism around Christmas must have irked him a bit.
Definitely.
And so that's what we kind of theorized that that's why he was kind of included in here. There's another explanation in Planet Narnia of why Father Christmas was included. Do you remember what that was?
No, I can't.
Okay, so again, we go back to the idea of joviality. Who is more jovial than Santa Claus?
Right.
Father Christmas is basically an incarnation of Jove.
Yeah.
He's the rubicund cheeks, and he's got a twinkle in his eye. He comes bearing gifts. He also, more importantly, brings about Christmas and therefore the coming spring, which is, of course, spring is associated with all types of things, including rebirth.
Yep.
And most prominently rebirth, I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, why he included Santa Claus.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually.
In this story, because a lot of people are like, "What the heck is Santa Claus doing here? We're in a completely mythical world. Why are you bringing someone from the real world Santa, into the fantasy world?" I mean, when I first read it, I didn't see much of a problem because Santa is Santa and Narnia. I feel like Santa could go to any imaginary world he liked. But
that didn't really catch me off guard. It catches a lot of other people off guard.
It does,
That's so
like, why is
random.
Santa here?
But it's not random at all.
No, it's not. And also, then Santa also wears red, and red is a color of Jove. So going back to that Planet Narnia book, there's a lot of interesting reasons in this book of some of the symbology that you see there, and that offers a bit of a different explanation than the Christian allegory explanation that is sort of the most popular one.
Yeah, and I think that's like what we've been, circling it back around, I think that's what we've been talking about, how this book is way deeper than it goes way beyond any kind of Christian allegory.
It's deceivingly simple. You know, when you read it, you might think, well, this is a good little story.
Yeah.
But there's not much to it.
Yeah.
You know, it seems so obvious on the surface that it's a story about Christ. But really, when you keep going back to it year after year, like the two of us do, and exploring other thinkers on the story, like Reeves and Ward, it's more layered and nuanced than you might at first appreciate.
There's a deepness to it, and there's even one point in the book where they talk about how Aslan is able to be resurrected because the witch knows the deep magic, which is essentially you could describe it as like the code of Narnia, this kind of like the contract of Narnia. But Aslan says the witch was not aware of the deeper magic, and I think that's an interesting metaphor for this book because there's a deepness to it more than meets the eye, than people give it credit for.
There's a lot to discuss in it's deceivingly simple. It's not what it appears at first. There's a lot more to it, and whether or not he really achieved in getting everything he wanted to across in the book, I don't know. But he definitely got across a lot more than just a simple allegorical story. He got across more than just a simple fairy tale. Yeah. And so, it's just it's a deeper read than you might at first anticipate.
Mm-hmm. It's a classic. It's
Yeah.
timeless. It's absolutely timeless. I mean, like it's Reeves at one point in his lecture series says that like some of you might have read The Hobbit first, some of you might have read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe 1st. It all depends on which one was handed to you.
Yep.
You know, and,
Yep.
and I think that's so true.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I guess there's anything else.
let me think. No, I don't think so.
I don't think so. Yeah.
No, I think that's about
it. Well, thank you all for watching. This has been our first installment of our book talk series.
Hopefully not the last.
Hopefully not the last. Oh, it definitely won't be. Yeah. So if you have any comments or any suggestions, any suggested books that you'd like us to read,
Yes.
and
Yeah,
make
good
videos
idea.
about, please comment below. Thanks for watching.